In the autumn of 1983, in Pembina County, North Dakota, a 62-year-old widow named Eleanor Vance did something that wasn't supposed to be possible. On October 5th, with the air smelling of diesel and frost, she delivered her final truckload of hard red spring wheat to the Cavalier grain co-op. When the final weight was tallied and the acreage calculated, her yield came to 78.4 bushels per acre. The county average that year, for farms using the best new seed money could buy, was 66.8. Her wheat, grown from seed her husband's grandfather had first selected in 1902, had outperformed every single one of them. This is not a story about a miracle. It is a story about a ledger, a handful of canvas bags, and the quiet authority of 81 years of accumulated knowledge. Let me tell you about the farm, because the land is the first character in this story. The Vance homestead was 300 acres, of which 288 were tillable, situated 6 miles west of the Red River.
The soil was Gardena silt loam, black and heavy and unforgiving. It would hold water like a sponge in a wet spring and bake into a cracked, concrete-like surface in a dry July. Thomas Vance Sr., Eleanor's husband's grandfather, had broken the prairie here in 1888. He had learned its moods the hard way, through 3 crop failures in his first decade. He learned that the south quarter, with its slight elevation, was the first to dry out, and the northwest corner, a shallow basin, was the last. He learned that a certain kind of rust seemed to creep in from the shelter belt to the east when August was damp and cool. He wrote it all down. He wrote it in a ledger with a dark green cover, its pages filled with a dense, spidery script. He noted the date he put the seed in the ground, the soil temperature at a depth of 3 inches, the variety of wheat, the rainfall each week, the first frost, the harvest date, and the final yield in bushels per acre.
When his son, Thomas Jr., took over in 1922, he continued the practice. When Eleanor's husband, Thomas III, took over in 1949, the ledger was already half full. He bought a second one. Thomas III had been 24 years old, just back from the war. Eleanor was 21. They had been married for 41 years when he suffered a heart attack on the seat of his John Deere 4440 in the spring of 1980. He was 65 years old. He left behind Eleanor, their son David, the 300 acres, an operating loan of $42,500 at 18.7% interest, and 2 green ledgers. And he left the seed. Let me tell you about the seed. It didn't have a fancy name from a university lab. The family just called it Vance Amber. In 1902, Thomas Sr. grew dissatisfied with the red fife wheat that was common at the time. He walked his fields just before harvest, when the heads were heavy and golden, and he didn't just pick the biggest, plumpest heads of grain. That's what everyone else did. He picked from the high ground that had suffered through the dry spell in July. He picked from the low ground that had nearly drowned in June. He picked from the edge of the field where the wind had whipped the stalks mercilessly. He gathered a few heads from plants that had rust on their lower leaves, but whose kernels were still full and hard. He was not selecting for perfection. He was selecting for survival. He stored this seed in canvas bags his wife Sarah had stitched from old sailcloth. Each year he would mix the seeds from all those different plants together, and that would be his seed stock for the next spring. He was, without knowing the term, creating a land race, a variety of wheat that was not uniform, not perfect, but was exquisitely adapted to the 300 acres of Gardena silt loam 6 miles west of the Red River. It was a library of genetic memory. In its DNA was the story of the drought of 1934, the wet year of 1953, the early frost of 1968. The Vance Amber wheat was a physical record of the farm's history, as much as the ledgers were a written one. After Thomas died, everyone assumed Eleanor would sell, or at least rent out the land. His son David was 35. He had a good job as a mechanic in Grand Forks and a family of his own. He loved the farm, but He saw the balance sheets. "Mum," he'd said gently, a month after the funeral, "the interest on that loan alone is almost $8,000 a year. Wheat is $3.70 a bushel. It's not sustainable." The banker, a kind but firm man named Mr. Abernathy, had said much the same thing over coffee at her kitchen table. He looked at her not with malice, but with a weary pity. He'd seen this story a dozen times. A farmer dies, the debt is too high, the widow can't manage. The farm gets sold to a larger corporate operation, another family name erased from a mailbox. Eleanor listened to all of them. She was 59 years old, her hands gnarled from a lifetime of work, her posture slightly stooped.
She was known for being quiet. Thomas had been the talker, the one who joked with the men at the co-op.
Eleanor was the observer, the keeper of the books, the one who knew the cost of every bolt and every gallon of diesel. When they had all finished explaining the sensible, logical, inevitable path she must take, she poured them another cup of coffee and said, "I believe I'll put a crop in." For 3 years, she did just that. She hired a local man for the heavy field work, but she made every decision. She read the old ledgers at night, comparing the weather of the current year to the weather of years past. In 1981, a dry year, she pulled out a page from 1958, another dry year. Thomas Jr. had written, "Planted shallow, 1.5 inches, held on better than Jacobson's." So she told the hired man to set the seed drill to 1.5 inches. Her yield was 4 bushels an acre, better than her neighbors. In 1982, a wet spring, she consulted the 1965 entry. Delayed planting 10 days until soil warmed.
Less root rot. She waited while everyone else rushed into their muddy fields. She again beat the county average, this time by 6 bushels. The men at the co-op stopped looking at her with pity and started looking at her with a kind of grudging curiosity. But 1983 was the year the world came to tell her she was wrong. The world arrived in the form of a man named Mark Jennings. He was 28 years old with a degree in agronomy from Purdue University and a boundless data-driven confidence. He worked for a company called Agri Solutions, and he came to the Cavalier Co-op in February of 1983 to give a presentation. The meeting room was packed. The farm crisis of the early 80s was strangling the county. Commodity prices were low, interest rates were sky high, and farmers were desperate for an edge, any edge. Jennings was a masterful presenter. He had a slide projector, a crisp suit, and a voice that radiated certainty. He was selling a new variety of wheat called GS770. The GS stood for genetic supremacy. It was, he explained, the product of a decade of research. It was engineered for maximum yield, perfect height uniformity for easy combining, and superior protein content. He showed slides of lush green fields, charts with upward trending lines, and testimonials from farmers in Iowa and Illinois. GS770 isn't just a seed, Jennings said, his voice resonating in the quiet room. It's a system. We provide the seed, the precise fertilizer recommendations based on your soil samples, and the specific pesticide and fungicide schedule to ensure the crop reaches its full genetic potential. We are taking the guesswork out of farming. He projected a final slide. It showed a projected yield of 85 bushels per acre. A low murmur went through the room. That was a number nobody in this county had ever seen. Then he offered the deal. Agri Solutions would finance the entire package, seed, fertilizer, chemicals, with a loan to be repaid at harvest.
It was a lifeline. For farmers staring at foreclosure notices, it felt like a miracle. During the question and answer session, Henry Jacobson, who farmed the section north of Eleanor's, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "What's the catch?" "No catch, Henry," Jennings said smoothly. "Just a partnership. We succeed when you succeed. All we require is that you follow the system precisely. Our data is very clear. Deviations from the protocol can and will impact yield." He paused, looking around the room, his eyes landing on Eleanor, who was sitting in the back, her hands folded in her lap.
"Look," Jennings said, adopting a more confidential tone. "Let's be honest. Many of you are farming the way your fathers and grandfathers did, and I respect that tradition. But tradition can't pay an 18% operating loan. Some of you are planting seed you saved yourself. It's inconsistent. It's a genetic liability. It's robbing you of yield. The Vance farm, for instance," he said, not unkindly, "a fine piece of land, but it's planted with an uncertified heirloom variety. Our soil analysis shows that land could be producing 20%, maybe 25% more than it is. That's the difference between profit and loss in today's market." All eyes turned to Eleanor. The room was silent. She didn't flinch. She just sat there, her expression unreadable. David, her son, sitting beside her, shifted uncomfortably. He had been captivated by the presentation, by the promise of certainty in an uncertain world.
After a long moment, Eleanor spoke, her voice clear and steady, not loud, but carrying to every corner of the room. "Mr. Jennings," she said, "my seed knows this dirt. It's been learning it for 81 years. A few of the older farmers nodded slowly, but the younger ones looked at Jennings. He smiled, a patient, condescending smile. "With all due respect, Mrs. Vance, seed doesn't learn. It has genetic traits. We've engineered better ones. This isn't about stories, it's about science." The debate was over before it began. After the meeting, nearly every farmer in the room signed up for the GS 770 program. They lined up at a folding table, their faces a mixture of hope and desperation, signing contracts that bound their harvest to agri-solutions. David tried to talk to his mother on the drive home. He said, "Mom, he has data. He has charts. We have stories." She didn't answer for a long time, just watched the frozen fields slide by in the dark. Finally, she said, "The ledger has data too. It's just a different kind." The pressure mounted in the weeks that followed. Mr. Abernathy, the banker, paid her another visit. He was more direct this time. "Eleanor," he said, stirring his coffee, "I have 14 other farm loans on my desk that are converting to the Agri-Solutions program. The bank sees it as a responsible, modern approach to risk management. It shows they are serious about maximizing their return. Your refusal to modernize is being noted." The threat was unspoken but clear. Her operating loan for the year, the money she needed for fuel and repairs, was not yet approved. She looked at him across the table her husband had built from oak harvested on the property. Thomas Sr. survived 1893 by planting in clumps, not rows, to keep the soil from blowing away. Thomas Jr. got through the Depression by saving the seed from the weakest-looking plants because they were the ones that made any grain at all with no rain. My Thomas got us through the rust epidemic of '54 because our wheat wasn't all the same. Some of it died, but not all of it. The bank has noted our farm has never once in 95 years defaulted on a loan. Has that been noted, Mr. Abernathy? He approved the loan the next day, but with a palpable reluctance. She was an anomaly, an inconvenient holdout in a world rushing towards standardized solutions. The community treated her with a strange mix of reverence and pity. She was the widow who was too stubborn to save herself. Let me tell you about the spring of 1983. It came in wet and cold. The Red River swelled its banks, and the fields stayed saturated through April and into May. The GS 770 planting protocol from Agri-Solutions was very specific. Plant between May 5th and May 15th for optimal germination. The farmers, following the rules, slogged into their fields, their heavy machinery compacting the wet soil. Mark Jennings was a constant presence, driving from farm to farm in his clean Ford pickup, checking soil temperatures, advising his clients. Eleanor watched and waited. She read the ledger entry for 1965, a similarly wet spring. Her father-in-law had written, "Waited for the dandelions to bloom on the high ridge. That's the sign the soil is warm enough to breathe. Planted May 24th. So she waited. Her neighbours had their wheat in the ground for 2 full weeks before she even started.
Henry Jacobson stopped his truck by her lane. "Eleanor, you're going to miss your window," he yelled over the sound of his engine. "That seed of yours will rot in this cold ground." She just waved and went back to her work. She planted on May 26th. The Vance amber seed went into soil that was warmer and drier. It germinated in 6 days. The GS 770, sitting in the cold, compacted soil of the neighbouring farms, took 11 days. Much of it suffered from root rot, forcing some farmers to reseed patches of their fields at great expense. Strike one for the system. Then came the summer. After the wet spring, the weather turned violently. From June 10th to July 22nd, a span of 42 days, less than half an inch of rain fell. The temperature soared into the 90s for 14 of those days. The heavy Gardena silt loam that had been a muddy swamp was now a cracked grey desert. The topsoil baked to a hard crust. The GS 770 wheat, with its shallow roots developed in the wet spring, began to suffer.
Its genetic code, optimized for ideal conditions with regular moisture, had no memory of drought. It had been engineered in a lab, not forged in the crucible of a North Dakota summer. To conserve energy, the plants began to abort some of their kernels. From the road, the fields looked fine, a uniform, pale green carpet. But up close, the heads were smaller than they should have been, with gaps where kernels had failed to develop. Eleanor's field was different. The Vance amber wheat was not uniform. It never was. Some plants were taller, some shorter. Some had thicker stalks, some thinner. This was the genetic liability Mark Jennings had spoken of. But this messiness was its strength. The plants with deeper roots, whose ancestors had survived the Dust Bowl, were tapping into the subsoil moisture. The shorter, tougher plants were shading the ground, reducing evaporation. Some of the weaker plants withered, yes, but the stronger ones thrived, their heads filling out with hard, dense kernels. Her field didn't look as pretty as Henry Jacobson's. It looked resilient. Mark Jennings drove the county roads, his face etched with worry. His confident pronouncements from February seemed a distant memory. He told the farmers to trust the system. He prescribed a new foliar fertilizer to reduce plant stress. It was another expense, another trip across the field burning expensive diesel. It didn't make it rain. Then in August the weather turned again. The heat broke, replaced by a persistent cool dampness. Fog hung in the low spots in the mornings. The humidity was high. These were perfect conditions for stem rust. The GS 770 was engineered to be resistant to the most common strains of rust, but it was a specific targeted resistance, and nature is clever. A slightly different strain, one that hadn't been prevalent in the test labs in Illinois, found a foothold. Because every single plant of GS 770 was genetically identical. There was no firewall. Once the rust got a start, it spread through the uniform fields like a slow-motion fire. The leaves developed reddish-brown pustules, and the plants, already weakened by the drought, began to die, their stalks turning black and brittle, the grain in their heads shriveling. Eleanor's field got the rust too, but again, the story was different. Some of her plants, the descendants of the ones Thomas Sr. had collected near the damp shelter belt 80 years prior, were highly susceptible. They blackened and died. But others, whose genetic lineage traced back to drier, windier parts of the field, showed remarkable resistance. The rust couldn't sweep through the field because the field wasn't a monoculture. It was a diverse neighbourhood of individuals. The susceptible plants were interspersed with resistant ones, creating a natural barrier. The damage was contained. Maybe 10% of her plants were badly affected. On some of the neighbouring farms, the loss was closer to 40%. Strike two. The harvest of 1983 began in the last week of September. A sense of dread hung over the county.
The combines rolling through the fields of GS 770 were kicking up clouds of black dust from the rusted stalks. The yields were coming in far below the promised 85 bushels an acre. Most were in the low 60s. After deducting the high cost of the seed and the chemicals and the extra fertilizer, many farmers were looking at a net loss. They had traded their grandfather's wisdom for a brochure and a promise, and now they were going to pay for it. Eleanor harvested last. Her field, with its mix of tall and short stalks, was harder to combine. The hired man had to drive slower, adjust the header height more often. It took an extra day. She didn't mind. She was in no hurry. She stood by the edge of the field, watching the old John Deere combine move back and forth, its auger spitting a stream of golden grain into the truck.
It looked clean. It looked heavy. The decisive moment came on October 5th, a Wednesday. It happened at the co-op weigh scale, the great arbiter of a farmer's year. It's a public place, a stage where success and failure are announced in stark, undeniable numbers. When Eleanor's final truck, an old 1971 International Lodestar, rumbled onto the scale, a small crowd had gathered. Henry Jacobson was there. So were a half-dozen other farmers who had signed up for the GS 770 program. And standing off to one side, holding a clipboard and looking pale, was Mark Jennings. Carl, the co-op manager, a man of 50 who had known Eleanor his whole life, took the weigh ticket. He did the calculations. Gross weight minus the truck's tare weight to get the net, then converting pounds of wheat to bushels. He did it twice to be sure. He adjusted his glasses. The silence was absolute, broken only by the hum of the aeration fans on the nearby grain bins. Eleanor stood by the truck's fender, her face calm.
David was next to her, looking more nervous than she was. He had spent the summer convinced his mother had made a terrible, sentimental mistake. Now, he wasn't so sure. Carl walked out of the scale house holding the ticket. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at the other farmers. He looked at Mark Jennings. Then he looked back at Eleanor. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was filled with something like awe. "You're at 78.4 bushels to the acre." For a full 5 seconds, no one moved. The number just hung in the air. 78.4. It was a figure that belonged to a different year, a different kind of weather, a different economy. It was impossible. Henry Jacobson, a man not known for his subtlety, blurted out, "The hell you say, Carl? Your scale's broke." Carl just shook his head. "Scale was certified by the state last Tuesday, Henry. The number is the number." The farmers started doing the math in their heads. The county average was coming in around 66.8. She was nearly 12 bushels better.
12 bushels an acre, over 288 acres. That was 3,456 extra bushels of wheat. At $3.56 a bushel, that was $12,305. It was more than the interest on her loan. It was the difference. It was everything. Mark Jennings just stood there staring at his clipboard, which was filled with projections and protocols and scientific certainties. None of them accounted for this. His system, designed for a perfect world, had been broken by an imperfect one. Eleanor's system, designed by 81 years of imperfect worlds, had thrived. He didn't say a word. He just slowly shook his head, turned, and walked to his clean Ford pickup. He drove away down the gravel road, leaving a cloud of dust that settled on the quiet crowd. David looked at his mother. Her face was unchanged, but he saw in her eyes not triumph, but a deep, quiet satisfaction. It was the look of a person whose faith in a long, slow process had been vindicated. He finally understood. The farm wasn't just a business. The seed wasn't just a commodity. They were a conversation between generations, a living trust of knowledge. He said, "Mom, I was wrong." She just put a hand on his arm. She said, "No, You were just listening to the wrong story. Let me tell you what happened after. The story of Eleanor Vance's wheat spread through the county like wildfire. That winter, 3 of her neighbors, including Henry Jacobson, came to her door, hats in their hands, and asked if they could buy some of her Vance amber seed for the next spring. She didn't sell it to them. She gave it to them, along with a handwritten page of notes copied from the old ledgers about how to plant it. It's not magic seed, she told them. You have to listen to what it needs. The next year, 10 more farmers came. The year after that, 20. By 1990, Vance amber wheat, the genetic liability, accounted for nearly 15% of the wheat planted in Pembina County. David eventually quit his job in Grand Forks and came back to the farm. He and Eleanor started a small side business, Vance Family Seed, selling their landrace wheat to farmers across the state who were tired of the expensive, fragile promises of corporate agriculture. They never got rich, but they never had to worry about the bank again. Mark Jennings was transferred by Agri Solutions to a sales territory in Central California. The company officially classified the 1983 GS770 performance in Pembina County as a weather-related anomaly. But the story, as told by a friend of David's who ran into Jennings at a conference years later, was that he was a changed man. He spent more time listening to the old farmers than he did talking. He was heard to say once that the most advanced data processing system in the world was a multi-generational family farm. Eleanor Vance continued to run the farm with David until she was well into her 80s. She passed away in 2005 at the age of 84. She is buried next to Thomas in the small cemetery overlooking the Red River Valley. On her gravestone, below her name and dates, David had a single line engraved. It says, "She listened to the land." The ledgers now sit on a shelf in David's office, next to a third one which he started. The canvas bags, patched and worn, are still used to store the seed stock for the next generation. The farm is still 300 acres. It survived the 80s, the 90s, and the turn of a new century. This was never a story about one woman's victory over a big company. It was a story about 2 different kinds of knowledge. One is loud, confident, and comes in a glossy brochure. It promises to erase risk and optimize the future. It is built on the belief that the past is an obstacle to be overcome. The other kind of knowledge is quiet, patient, and written in pencil in a faded green ledger. It is built on the belief that the past is a library and that resilience is a lesson taught by generations of failure. One kind of knowledge is designed for the spreadsheet. The other is designed for the storm. The storm of 1983 was not an anomaly. The storm is the rule. The quiet, sunny days are the exception. What survives is not what is perfect. What survives is what has learned to bend. What is rigid breaks.